long ago, I was trying to get in touch with a friend who builds houses for a living. And after a number of phone calls and text messages, I sent him an email, and later that evening he replied. Well, it turns out that he'd recently given up his cell phone and was learning to live without it. Now, I commented that this seemed like a risky venture, seeing as he was continually in touch with clients, and what happened if he ran out of materials on the job site and needed more? Frankly, wasn't his smartphone the smartest thing to have happened to his business in years? And the digital photos that he sent to clients, asking them where they want a light fixture located, and then getting an answer from them, sometimes minutes or even seconds later. What was he going to do now? Guess at where the light fixture should go? Hope for the best? Frankly, I was dumbfounded. My friend is a smart person and an accomplished contractor. And it seemed to me that in giving up his cell phone, he was going to negatively affect his productivity and probably put his hard-earned and long-standing reputation as a master craftsman on the line. So I asked him, why did you unplug? His answer has been nagging at me for months, and I submit that it's an answer worth nagging at you too. I asked my friend why he gave up his cell phone, and he thought it over and then replied simply, sometimes there is too much communication. Now, on the one hand, this seems obvious. Most of us here today have probably had times felt swamped by a massive digital tide that sweeps over our lives, burying us in communication we've neither solicited nor are remotely interested in. At the same time, to assume that there is such a thing as too much information can induce a kind of cognitive dissonance in that we typically believe that more is always more, and that, particularly in our country, to limit communication in any way is akin to sacrilege or fascism. So there's a dilemma, right? I mean, for instance, how often have you craved the latest iteration of some new communication device when the iteration you currently own remains perfectly functional and well adapted to your uses? And at the same time, how often have you felt guilty for spending too much time on that communication device and wished for a little less communication? To turn down the noise, or clear out the clutter, or just chill out, or all by yourself, alone. Well, the truth is that in giving up his cell phone, my friend did something that most of us here today regard, perhaps rightly, as socially suicidal and professionally insane. Most of us don't have the guts to communicate less. Quite the contrary. We are obsessive-compulsive in our multitasking. We are continually adding rather than deleting new communication technologies to our repertoire. The romantic image of the individual reflecting solitarily beneath a tree has given way to a virtual image of the individual lounging potato-like on the couch. The television toggling back and forth in front of them between The Voice, Biggest Loser, Modern Family, the laptop on their lap open simultaneously to Facebook, Call of Duty, eBay, the earbud in their ear, buzzing loudly with the sounds of Kesha, Kanye, Cole Porter, the phone in their hand, buzzing incessantly with an endless series of celebrity tweets and multiple texts from multiple best friends forever, going something like, LOL, OMG, WTF. WTF indeed. Sherry Turkle, who studies the relationship of technology to the self at MIT, calls this the condition of being alone together. alone together, solitary but connected, solo without the solitude. And while being alone together naturally has implications for our sense of privacy, our agency, our autonomy, I think that its most profound effect is on those unplugged spaces that previously we reserved for ourselves. And as we become more reliant on technology to fill those spaces, we are driving away solitude while paradoxically becoming lonelier and more isolated. Now, this is a tricky idea. Less solitude, more isolation. Alone together. From his mid-19th century vantage, Thoreau saw this coming, of course, and wrote that I have never found a companion more companionable than solitude. We are more lonely when we are abroad amongst men than we are when we stay in our chambers. Well, what Thoreau didn't see coming, of course, is that these days we can go abroad amongst men and stay in our chambers at the same time, but without the companion of solitude to share the road ahead with. There's a great insight about solitude in a story told by Lawrence Millman, a National Geographic reporter, about being stranded on a remote, uninhabited island for a few days in the far northern reaches of the Arctic Sea, along with a couple of native guides he's hired. And without a phone or a radio or any means of communicating with the outside world, Millman is forced inward and has to reckon with his nature and his self. And when the guides finally get the motor on the boat running again, and they're getting ready to leave the island and return to civilization, Millman says the most extraordinary thing. He says, I felt sad, like I was surrendering some rare privilege. And then he hits it, the privilege of solitude. The irony, of course, is that Millman goes to the end of the earth to discover solitude, and of course most of us can't do that. So how can we, the most plugged-in society in the world, find a solitude that does not make us lonelier and more isolated, but its opposite, a stillness that deepens and enriches, a stillness like Millman experienced as a privilege? Well, I think we can begin by practicing solitude intentionally as a counterbalance to our lives. To not practice solitude is to drive or run away from ourself, and to embrace a notion of the self as entirely a social construction. And while the self is and always will be social, never before have we had the technological means to construct such virtual identities for ourselves that become so fundamental to who we are, and certainly never on such a mass scale. You know, we ask this question these days, are you my friend or are you my Facebook friend? And we laugh at that, not because it's funny, but because we know it's getting more difficult to discern the difference between the two. And I think solitude as a practice can help us navigate that. When I checked in with my friend recently to see how he was doing with his newfound solitude, once again his answer surprised me. After giving up his phone, he had found, not surprisingly, that he was working without so many interruptions, and that in fact he had grown more efficient and productive, finishing projects on time where previously he had been unable to, simply because of his phone. Further, even though his clients were still struggling with this and not being able to get a hold of him all the time, he felt that he was forming stronger relationships with them, founded more on trust and respect, rather than a kind of anxious 24/7 digital communication about details and deadlines, most of which were utterly inconsequential. But above all, he felt that his business and his reputation had not been harmed. Quite the contrary, that his beautiful houses continued to speak for themselves in the world and continued to generate positive word of mouth and referrals. But most importantly, my friend said that for the first time in years he was enjoying his work again, doing one thing at a time and doing it well. As Marshall McLuhan wrote, we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. Use your tools wisely. Thank you.